I expect most of you know the Gospels well enough to know that it was the women who provided for Jesus. They did so during his life, and they did so even unto death. Joanna, the two Marys, and the other women never left Jesus. They did not flee in fear as many of his closest followers did, and they did not hide their eyes at his suffering. They were with Jesus as he traveled to the cross, and they watched at a distance when Jesus took his final breath. They followed Joseph of Arimathea as he removed the lifeless body of Jesus from the cross, wrapped it in a linen cloth, and laid it in a rock-hewn tomb. The women provided for Jesus in life, and they would provide for him in death as well. Following the crucifixion, they went back home, and they prepared spices and ointments to anoint his body, to stave off the stench of death, if only for a short time. And then they approached the tomb at early dawn and were confounded by what they saw. The stone was rolled away, the tomb was empty, and then when they went inside, the women did not find the body. Into the desolate silence, into the terrifying absence of the body of Jesus, the words came to the women almost unbidden. They began to cling anew to the promises of their faith. I have called you by name. You are mine. Wherever two or three are gathered, I am there also. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. Peace, peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. And perhaps most of all, remember, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. Jesus was placed in a stone-cold tomb, but that tomb could not contain the living Christ. He would not be found there, for he is risen. We trust in the one who is the resurrection and the life. Why do we look for the living among the dead? We are the people of God who gather week after week to sing of a God who sustains us. We are the people of God who are nourished as we share bread and cup around the table. We are the people of God who honestly give voice to anger and disappointment and fear and hope. We are the body of Christ. We are the body of the one who calls us to himself and sends us out. We are carriers of the promise. We are bearers of good news. The body of Christ is found in the very places we may be tempted to regard as God-forsaken. The body of Christ is found in places cloaked in darkness, in places where death threatens, in places where despair prevails. It is into such places that the body of Christ breathes new life. The flooding in Louisiana last August was epic. The needs were overwhelming. A grieving widow tells her heartbreaking story with gratitude for her partners in recovery. She says her brother came by boat to rescue her from her home, which was quickly filling with water. And he took her to his home, which was safely out of the floodplain. But 2 days later, his house flooded. It was another anxious night, another water rescue, another displacement. But volunteers from Presbyterian Disaster Assistance showed up quickly, and they were there for the long haul. They were still at work long after many other volunteers had moved on to the next crisis. The woman recalls the large acts of generosity which sustained her, but her voice catches as she recalls the repeated small acts of kindness. When the water finally receded and she returned to her house, which was destroyed, volunteers from Presbyterian Disaster Assistance were there ahead of her. They helped her survey the considerable damage, and they helped her make a plan. And then they washed her dishes. They had belonged to her grandmother, and they had survived the flood. They washed, dried, wrapped, and packed them for a move into a storage unit. They provided lunch for her, and together they told stories about that grandmother and other people who mattered. They laughed and they cried together. The woman says, you know, only the people of God do things like that. The body of Christ in the midst of devastating loss. Pepito was 19 years old. It was toward the end of Lent when he was gunned down in his neighborhood in Kensington on the north side of Philadelphia. His friends held a vigil. Their grief was raw. In response, a congregation in the area decided to change the location of their Good Friday service. The service, instead of being held in their sanctuary, would be held outside the shop where the gun used to kill Pepito had been sold illegally. The body of Christ gathered in the midst of the world's pain. The young men of the neighborhood had seen many friends killed or wounded on the streets, and one of them carried a large wooden cross, placing it in front of the gun shop. The community gathered there, and they read the gospel story of the violent murder of Jesus on that first Good Friday. And then they heard the gospel writers speak of how the women wept at the foot of the cross. With tears running down their faces, mothers told stories about losing their own kids to violence. Something profound happened on that Good Friday. The tears of those women 2,000 years ago met the tears of the women standing on the street. Calvary met Kensington. The suffering of Jesus met the suffering of the 21st century streets. Pepito's mom said through tears, "I get it. Now I really get it. God understands my pain because God knows what it's like to lose his son." In the cross, in the word, in the community, she who had lost so much encountered the living, breathing gospel for the very first time. The body of Christ broken for her. A couple of weeks ago, Stanley Community Christian Ministry opened a food pantry in Norwood. It was at the urging of the Norwood churches, even though it is only about 10 miles from Norwood to Albemarle to the food pantry. That's a long way for someone to go if they don't have a car. So the opening in Norwood was what we might call a soft opening. That is, there had been no publicity, it was only word of mouth. And volunteers had been warned on that afternoon that it may be very slow. But it would be good, a good time for them to work out the kinks in the new system. When the doors opened at 2 o'clock, 6 people were waiting outside the door. By the end of the day, 25 families had been served. Among those was a man on disability who is paying rent but doesn't yet have money to turn on his electricity. And an elderly woman whose medical bills have piled up after a winter of suffering with flu, pneumonia, and other complications. And a retiree who finally gave up her job at Walmart. Her legs were no longer able to walk up and down the long aisles. And then there was a young mother with 3 children doing what she could just to get by. Many people who came that day were not receiving what they needed, and they were unaware that such services were available. So now there is a place close to home where needs can be met and each person is regarded as a precious member of the human family. The body of Christ responding to needs in the neighborhood. The body of Christ, as our gospel story tells us, cannot be found among the tombs. Because, friends, Christ is alive. The tomb is empty. He is risen. We are the people who are called to live and breathe the resurrection. We are the ones who are called to tell the story and to show its power. We find the risen Christ in the suffering people of God. And we meet the risen Christ where the love of God is proclaimed in word and in deed. We join the risen Christ when the work of his body touches the needs of the lonely, the lost, and the forgotten. We are the body of Christ, created in God's image. And we are sent out to breathe new life into the dark corners of the world, to bear the good news of the one who lived and died and rose again for the sake of you and me and all of creation. The body of Christ is right here. We are the body of Christ. Christ is alive and comes to bring good news to this and every age, till earth and sky and ocean ring with joy, with justice, with love and praise. Amen.